She was only 16 years old, trembling before a crowd that came not to cheer, but to watch her die. The air hung heavy over Tower Green. The girl they called the 9-Day Queen knelt on cold wood, her lips whispering a prayer no one could hear. What the crowd didn't know, what history still hides, is how much she suffered before this moment. Her last hours were not graceful. They were terrifying, lonely, and real. This is the story your teachers never told you, the execution of Lady Jane Grey the Queen England tried to erase. The sound of the axe striking wood has echoed through centuries, yet the name of the girl who faced it has faded into polite footnotes. Lady Jane Grey, once crowned Queen of England for 9 fragile days, became a symbol of power's cruelty, wrapped in silence. To most people, she is a paragraph in a history book. To those who look deeper, she is a warning carved in blood. Jane wasn't born to rule, she was born into expectation. Educated, obedient, and brilliant, she was the perfect daughter for a family obsessed with titles. Every lesson she learned about virtue and faith was twisted into a weapon by those hungry for control. When she looked into the mirror, she saw a scholar. The world saw a pawn. At 16, she spoke Latin more fluently than most men at court. She debated theology with confidence that unsettled bishops twice her age. But her intelligence was not protection, it was temptation. The Duke of Northumberland, England's most powerful man, saw in her a path to the throne, a way to keep his influence after the young king's death. And so the plot began, silent, elegant, and deadly. They told Jane she was chosen by God. They told her it was her duty to lead. What they didn't tell her was that she was being led to the scaffold long before she ever wore the crown. The summer of 1553 was heavy with fear. King Edward VI, barely 15, was dying. Mary Tudor waited in the shadows, ready to reclaim her right as the next monarch. But for those who stood to lose everything under Mary's rule, Jane became a convenient savior. They married her to Guilford Dudley, the Duke's son, binding her fate to their scheme. Days later, Edward was dead, and Jane was told she would be queen. She cried when they brought her the crown. Witnesses wrote that she trembled and protested, begging not to accept it. But refusal was treason, obedience was survival. On July 10, 1553, she entered the Tower of London not as a prisoner, but as its sovereign. Trumpets sounded, banners waved. Yet the people did not cheer. They looked at her, this pale, frightened girl, and saw uncertainty. Mary's supporters were already gathering. Within days, the streets of London whispered a different name, Queen Mary. The same walls that had been her palace would soon become her cage. Still, Jane prayed. Her letters from that week speak of faith, duty, and confusion. She asked God for wisdom, not victory. And perhaps that is what made her story so unbearable. She never wanted the power that killed her. History would later paint her as a gentle martyr, but the truth was messier, crueler. She was surrounded by adults who lied, men who used her signature to rewrite destiny. When their plan collapsed, they vanished into shadows. She remained, a 16-year-old girl branded as a traitor. Imagine her, alone in a stone chamber, the echo of footsteps outside her cell marking the rhythm of her final days. Each sound reminded her of what she had lost, freedom, innocence, and choice. And yet, even in that silence, she found clarity. She began to understand that power, real power, was never in the crown. It was in the courage to face truth, even when truth meant death. That realization would carry her through the days ahead, through betrayal, imprisonment, and the unspeakable morning when the world would finally come to watch her die. Because Lady Jane Grey was not executed simply for being a queen. She was executed for daring to exist at the intersection of innocence and politics. And what came next was far worse than you were ever taught. They called her Majesty, but she never felt like one. The crown that touched her head wasn't made for her. It was forged out of desperation. And in the dim light of her coronation day, surrounded by men twice her age and none of her courage, Lady Jane Grey realized she was being celebrated for her own destruction. The room smelled of incense and betrayal. Her hand shook as the heavy golden crown was lowered onto her hair. Those watching called it a sacred moment, but Jane felt the weight of a noose. Every voice that cheered for her throne was the same voice that would later whisper traitor. Even then, somewhere deep in her chest, she knew this was not her victory. This was her sentence. She was 16, and already trapped in a political web, spun by powerful men whose names the world would forget long before hers. The Duke of Northumberland, her father-in-law, stood behind her with the calmness of a man who believed he could outplay God himself. To him, Jane was a chess piece, a clever, educated girl who could speak Latin and Greek, but not say the one word that mattered, no. When she sat on the throne for the first time, her fingers grazed the fabric, soft as clouds but cold as marble. The courtiers bowed, pretending loyalty, their eyes already measuring the odds of survival. Her husband, Guilford Dudley, stood beside her, pale, anxious, and silent. Their marriage had been arranged like a business deal, sealed with the ink of politics, not love. And Jane, though kind, never loved him. She barely knew him. Now, they were bound by chains of fear disguised as wedding vows. Outside, the city was restless. The people didn't want Jane. They wanted Mary, the rightful heir, daughter of Henry VIII. Rumors flooded the streets like smoke. Londoners tore down Jane's banners before they even dried in the summer air. And within the tower, whispers grew louder each night. The guards changed their tone. The servants hesitated before bowing. Something was coming. Jane began writing letters to her family, measured, polite, trembling with truth between the lines. She thanked them for their prayers. She wrote that she would serve her country faithfully. But between each carefully chosen word, her fear bled through. She was young, bright, and brave, but she was surrounded by wolves. For 9 days, she tried to rule a kingdom that refused to see her. 9 days of pretending she had power, while the real power, her enemies, tightened their grip around her throat. Her counselors urged her to issue decrees, sign laws, make royal statements. Every time she hesitated, they reminded her of her duty. Every time she signed, they smiled like executioners sharpening their blades. Meanwhile, Mary Tudor's forces were advancing, riding toward London, gathering an army that didn't need gold or titles to fight. They fought for blood, for lineage, for vengeance. And while Jane prayed for peace, her name was already being erased from the coinage of England. Her reign, if one could even call it that, was collapsing faster than it began. On the 6th night, Jane stopped sleeping. Her ladies-in-waiting heard her pacing until dawn, whispering scripture under her breath. They said she looked pale, her eyes hollow but calm. She told them she had dreamt of water, dark, endless water, and a crown sinking beneath it. She took it as a sign. God was calling her home. By the 8th day, the council that had sworn allegiance to her betrayed her completely. They rode to Mary's side, pledging loyalty to the woman they once called enemy. In exchange for mercy, they offered up a teenage girl, their queen. When the news reached Jane, she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply sat by the window of the tower chamber, staring out at the gray sky, the city she had never truly ruled. She whispered, "I am undone," and folded her hands as if in prayer. Perhaps she knew then that the crown she never wanted would become her shroud. That night, Guilford, her husband, broke down. He begged the guards to help them escape, promising wealth and land. No one answered. Even love, fragile as it was, could not save them. In that stone fortress that had once been her palace, Jane finally understood the truth of power. It was never hers. It never belonged to any queen who lacked soldiers to defend it. On the 9th day, the tower bells rang, not for victory, for surrender. Mary had entered London to the sound of a roaring crowd. The same people who ignored Jane's coronation now knelt for her cousin's triumph. Trumpets echoed through the streets, drowning the last whispers of Jane's name. In that moment, the 9-day queen ceased to exist. She was no longer royal, no longer safe, just a girl trapped in history's cruelest trade, innocence for authority. They stripped her title, her robes, her crown. The same guards who once called her Your Majesty now called her Lady Grey. Her world shrank to 4 damp walls and the slow passing of footsteps beyond her cell. But even then, she held herself with quiet dignity. The daughter of ambition, the victim of faith, the girl who never sought the throne, she bowed her head not to power, but to God. In her silence, there was something hauntingly powerful, because while her reign lasted 9 days, her story would echo for centuries, not for what she ruled, but for what was taken from her. And yet, the worst was still to come. Because for Lady Jane Grey, the true horror wasn't losing the throne. It was realizing that those who put her there were now plotting how to watch her die. They said loyalty was everything. But in the tower, loyalty was currency, and everyone around Lady Jane Grey was ready to sell. The first betrayal didn't come from her enemies. It came from those who once kissed her hand. Men who had crowned her queen now swore allegiance to Mary Tudor, pretending they had never stood beside Jane at all. Their signatures on her decrees, their words, their promises, vanished overnight, like ink washed from paper by rain. Jane didn't see it happen, she heard it. Whispers through the keyhole, the clatter of hurried footsteps, the change in the guard's tone when they spoke her name. No longer Your Majesty, but a simple, cold Lady Grey. That was how she knew her life was shifting from royal privilege to death sentence. She tried to stay calm, she prayed, but every prayer echoed back unanswered. The air inside her chamber grew heavier each night, thick with dread. Even her husband, Guildford, had begun to crumble. He asked the guards for news, begged for word of mercy from Mary's camp. When he returned to her, his face told the story she didn't want to hear. Mary had won, and the council, the same men who had crowned Jane, were kneeling to her cousin now. Jane didn't curse them. She didn't cry. She simply whispered, "I forgive them." But her voice trembled, and her hands refused to stop shaking. Forgiveness is easier to write in a Bible than to feel when your own death is being signed. Her father, Henry Grey, had been one of her loudest supporters. He'd pushed her forward when she begged to step back. He told her she was chosen by God, that destiny had called her to the throne. Now he was gone too, offering his allegiance to Mary to save himself. A father's love traded for safety, a daughter's life offered in silence. That was the betrayal that broke her, not the politics, not the council, her father. For the first time, she stopped reading her scriptures. She sat in the corner of her chamber, staring at her hands, whispering, "I was never meant to be queen." Outside, the world was already moving on. Taverns filled with laughter. Mary's face adorned new coins. The people who once shouted, "Long live Queen Jane," now spat at the mention of her name. The Duke of Northumberland, the man who had orchestrated it all, was the first to fall, captured, accused, and executed. But before his death, he did something unthinkable. He recanted his faith, publicly converting to Catholicism in a desperate attempt to save his soul and his sons. The same faith he'd forced upon Jane, he abandoned to survive, and that cowardice would cost her everything. Because when Mary's council saw Northumberland bend, they decided Jane must bend too. They sent priests to her cell, urging her to renounce her Protestant faith, to convert for forgiveness. Jane refused, calmly, softly, without hesitation. "My faith is all that is mine," she said. "They have taken the rest." That defiance, that single quiet act of strength, sealed her fate. Mary could have spared her. Many believe she would. After all, Jane was young, a pawn, not a player. But the pressure from her advisors and the church was relentless. Jane's continued existence was dangerous. She was a symbol, fragile, innocent, but powerful enough to ignite rebellion. To let her live was to risk war. And so, the decision was made. Mary signed the warrant for Jane's execution. One stroke of ink that turned family into murderers, faith into crime, and a 16-year-old girl into a condemned queen. When Jane learned of it, she didn't scream. She didn't beg. She only asked for one thing, to die before my husband. She said she couldn't bear to hear him suffer. But fate, cruel as ever, had no mercy left to give. In the days that followed, she was allowed a Bible and ink to write her final letters. Her handwriting, once elegant and steady, now trembled like candlelight in wind. She wrote to her sister Catherine, "Live still to die, that by death you may purchase eternal life." She wrote to her father, the man who abandoned her, "The Lord comfort you, and may you seek repentance, for I pray daily for your soul." She wasn't writing out of anger. She was writing as someone who had already accepted she would die. Each day, she heard the sound of construction from outside, the creak of wood, the echo of hammers. At first, she didn't understand. Then she saw it from her window, a scaffold being built. Her scaffold. They didn't hide it from her. Perhaps they wanted her to watch, to let her die before dying. At night, she dreamed of her childhood garden, sunlight through the leaves, the laughter of her sisters, her mother's voice, and every morning she woke to stone, chains, and the faint smell of death that lingered in the tower air. Betrayal wasn't a single act. It was slow, patient, like poison working through her veins. By the time they told her the date of her execution, she was beyond fear. She simply nodded, her voice steady as she said, "I am ready, ready." Not because she wanted to die, but because she was tired of watching those she loved become strangers to save themselves. Her life had been traded away piece by piece. Her crown, her faith, her freedom, her father. All that remained was her name. And soon even that would be written in blood. In the Tower of London, betrayal wasn't the end of trust. It was the beginning of history. And history would remember her not as a queen who lost her throne, but as a girl who was betrayed by everyone who put her on it. When the tower gates shut behind her, the echo sounded like a closing world. The same fortress that had once crowned her now became her tomb. Cold mist clung to the stone as Jane was led through shadowed corridors, her pale face flickering in torchlight. She didn't resist. The weight of defeat pressed so heavy that even fear seemed too heavy to carry. A guard opened a wooden door with iron hinges that groaned like old ghosts. Inside, a narrow room waited, bare except for a wooden bed, a Bible, and the silence of abandonment. That silence would soon become her only companion. Days blurred. Light seeped through a small barred window, never bright enough to tell time. Jane began counting prayers instead of hours. Every creak in the walls reminded her of the life she had lost, the sound of silk dresses in hallways, the laughter of courtiers pretending loyalty, the smell of roses from her family garden. All gone, replaced by damp stone and the constant drip of water from somewhere unseen. The tower wasn't a prison of chains, it was a prison of waiting. Sometimes she heard footsteps in the corridor, guards changing shift, or maybe just pacing to pass the time. Once she heard a scream echo through the halls. Another prisoner. Another soul condemned by politics disguised as justice. It was then she realized the tower wasn't filled with enemies of the crown, it was filled with the forgotten. And soon she would join them. Letters arrived from Mary's envoys. Each one sounded kind, almost merciful, but beneath every polite phrase lay a blade. They offered her life in exchange for her faith. If she renounced her beliefs and accepted the Catholic Church, she might live. Jane read every letter carefully, her hands trembling, her eyes filling not with hope but sorrow. "They ask me to deny the only truth that gives me peace," she whispered. The ink blurred where her tears fell. She refused. Her faith was her last piece of freedom, and she guarded it with more strength than she ever held as queen. When Guildford sent word from his own cell, it broke her resolve for a moment. His handwriting was frantic, pleading. He wanted to see her one last time. Jane hesitated. The thought of facing him, the boy who had shared her crown, her fear, her sentence, was too much. She wrote back only once, telling him to turn his heart toward God and not toward her. "We shall meet again," she said, "but not in this world." It was the kindest way she could say goodbye. Her body grew thin, her skin lost color. The guards began to look at her differently, not as a prisoner, but as something sacred, doomed, and tragic. One guard, barely older than Jane, once slipped her a candle to read by. When she thanked him, his eyes filled with tears. Even those who served her captors couldn't bear the sight of her quiet endurance. The cruelty of her sentence wasn't in the pain, it was in the calmness she carried through it. Then came the night when everything changed. She awoke to the sound of hammering outside her window. At first, she thought it was construction for repairs. Then she heard the murmur of soldiers, the scraping of wood, the muffled laughter of men pretending not to feel shame. A scaffold. They were building her scaffold. Jane knelt by the window, watching in silence. The sky was black, no stars, just torches flickering below, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Every blow of the hammer was another heartbeat stolen from her. Yet she did not cry. She whispered instead, "Lord, teach me how to die well." Morning arrived without sunlight. A gray fog hung over the river, wrapping the tower in stillness. Jane's chaplain, Dr. Feckenham, entered her cell. He looked at her as if seeing an angel in human form. "The Queen has signed the warrant," he said softly. Jane nodded. "I know," she whispered. She had known since the night the hammers sang. Feckenham asked if she wished to pray. She smiled faintly. "I have not stopped." She spent that day writing. Her Bible, now worn and smudged, held her last words. To her father, she wrote forgiveness, true, undeserved, complete. To her sister, she wrote faith. To the world, she left silence. When she finally put the quill down, her hand was trembling so badly that the ink splattered. She didn't bother to wipe it. There was nothing left to clean. As dusk fell, she heard the church bells from across the river. It was the same rhythm she'd heard as a child on Sundays, a sound of peace now turned to prophecy. Somewhere in the tower, Guildford was praying too. Tomorrow, they would both die, but not together. The guards wouldn't allow that, Mercy. She asked once more to see him, only to be told it was forbidden. Then at least tell him, she said quietly, that my last thought will be of peace. That night, she did not sleep. She read from the book of Matthew again and again. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Her lips moved in silence, her breath shallow. The candle burned low, flickering against the walls. She traced her fingers over the Bible's pages, not as a queen, but as a frightened child searching for courage. By dawn, she was ready. She folded her gown neatly at the foot of her bed, her hair braided back. The guard came to the door, his voice trembling. "It is time, my lady." Jane looked up, eyes steady, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then God grant me strength." As she stepped into the hallway, she glanced once at the window, the faint light of morning touching the scaffold below. It looked smaller than she had imagined, and somehow more human. Every step toward it felt both endless and freeing. The tower had taken her crown, her family, her freedom. But as she walked toward her death, she carried something no king or queen had ever held, so purely unbroken faith. The fall of a queen had never looked so quiet, never sounded so calm, and that calmness was what made it so unbearably cruel, because the world was about to witness not the death of a ruler, but the end of a child who never wanted the throne, yet faced her end with more dignity than the kingdom that condemned her. They told her she would die on the morning of February 12th. The words were spoken gently, as if soft voices could make them kind. Jane listened without trembling. There was no fear left, only understanding. For days she had been preparing, not for death, but for peace. The moment the warrant was signed, she stopped thinking of escape. She no longer prayed to live, she prayed to forgive. They allowed her to write her final letter to her sister. Her hands were unsteady, but her thoughts were sharp. She warned Catherine not to be deceived by power or comfort, to hold her faith above all else. She wrote as if she were still teaching, as if her death might serve as a final lesson. Every line carried the grace of someone who had accepted injustice without surrendering to it. When the priest visited again, he spoke of mercy. He told her that Queen Mary still held the power to spare her if she renounced her faith. Jane smiled faintly. "Then I would save my body," she said, "but lose my soul." He begged her to reconsider, reminding her she was only 16, that her life could still serve God. She replied, "I serve him better this way." Her calm terrified them more than her defiance. There was no anger, no resistance, only certainty. Even her executioners seemed uneasy. They wanted a sinner, a frightened girl, not a saint in plain clothes. Her composure made them small, made their orders feel monstrous. They avoided her gaze when they spoke, as though she could see the truth hiding behind their obedience. The night before her execution, she was allowed to see her husband one last time. The request came unexpectedly, and she hesitated before agreeing. When they brought Guilford to her chamber, they both stared for a moment, unsure what to say. He looked pale, exhausted, his eyes red from sleepless nights. She reached for his hand, and he gripped it tightly. Neither spoke at first. Finally, he whispered, "Perhaps they will change their minds." Jane shook her head gently. "You must not hope for mercy from those who know none." He asked if she was afraid. She told him no, but it wasn't the truth. She was afraid, but not of death. She feared what might happen to her soul if she allowed hate to take root in her heart. She feared she might die angry. She prayed that she wouldn't. When they parted, Guilford turned back one last time. "I will see you soon," he said. She nodded, though they both knew what soon meant. Hours later, she was told that her husband was dead. They had executed him first, outside her view, but not out of her hearing. Someone had made a cruel mistake. His cries echoed faintly through the courtyard, carried to her window. Jane froze when she heard the muffled sound of a crowd, then the silence that followed. She didn't cry. She whispered his name once, then sat down with her Bible. The words blurred on the page, but she kept reading, her lips moving without sound. Soon after, a messenger came to tell her it was time. She asked for a few more minutes alone. When the guard hesitated, she looked at him with such quiet authority that he obeyed without question. Alone, she knelt and prayed aloud. She asked for forgiveness, not for herself but for everyone who had betrayed her. She prayed for her father, for Queen Mary, even for the men who had built the scaffold. "They know not what they do," she said softly. Before they led her away, she handed her prayer book to one of her ladies and said, "When I am gone, give this to my sister. It has all I leave her, faith and truth." She looked at the small group of attendants who had stayed with her to the end. Do not weep, she told them. Weep for those who still think power can save them. As she walked through the corridors, no one spoke. The guards avoided looking at her, some crossing themselves as she passed. Jane moved quietly, her steps deliberate, her face serene. She wasn't pretending to be brave. She simply refused to give her captors the satisfaction of seeing her break. At the base of the stairs, one of her ladies tried to speak but couldn't. Jane touched her hand and said, "All is well." Those were her last words before stepping outside. Moments later, she saw what awaited her: a block of wood, a crowd of strangers, and a man holding an axe who couldn't meet her eyes. She said nothing. She climbed the steps herself. The officials read her sentence aloud, their voices hollow. When they asked for her final words, she said only this: "I do wash my hands in innocence before God in the face of you all." She knelt, blindfolded herself, and whispered a final prayer. "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." But then came a moment that history rarely mentions. Blindfolded, trembling, she couldn't find the block. Her hands searched the air helplessly. Her voice broke. "What shall I do? Where is it?" The silence that followed was unbearable. Someone guided her hand, and she touched the cold wood. Her body stilled. Her final words were barely audible. "Lord, receive my soul." The axe fell. And just like that, the girl who had once been England's queen was gone. Her crown stolen, her innocence slaughtered, her faith unbroken. No shouts, no glory, no redemption, just the quiet horror of justice without mercy. They buried her within the Tower grounds beside her husband. No ceremony, no hymn, just 2 young lives erased by fear and ambition. The same people who had used her name now spoke it in whispers, afraid of what it reminded them of. In those final days, Jane Grey became more than a queen. She became a mirror reflecting the cruelty of a world that devours its own purity. Her death wasn't simply execution. It was an indictment of power, a question history never dared to answer. What kind of kingdom kills its children to feel safe? The morning began with footsteps outside her chamber, measured, deliberate, and final. No one needed to speak. Jane already knew what they meant. She rose calmly and adjusted her gown with hands that no longer trembled. There was no mirror in the room, but she didn't need one. Vanity had long left her. What she prepared for now was not appearance, but grace. When the guards entered, they looked at her like men haunted by their own orders. The youngest of them, unable to meet her eyes, whispered, "Forgive me, my lady." She answered softly, "You have nothing to forgive. Do your duty." It was not resignation. It was mercy. Even as she faced the end, she gave comfort to those who came to end her life. They led her through the narrow corridors toward the courtyard. Every step echoed like a heartbeat counting down. Jane didn't struggle, didn't pause. She walked with quiet dignity, holding her small Bible pressed to her chest. The words she had written inside were still fresh. "If justice is done with my body, my soul shall find mercy." When she reached the scaffold, a crowd had gathered: courtiers, soldiers, priests, and silent witnesses who came not to see justice, but to see a spectacle. They had seen executions before, but not like this. This was not a traitor. This was a child, a scholar, a queen who had reigned for 9 days and was now about to die for decisions she never made. An official stepped forward and began reading the formal charges. The words sounded rehearsed, hollow, meaningless. Jane listened without expression. When he finished, she asked for permission to speak. The official hesitated but nodded. Her voice, calm and clear, carried across the courtyard. "Good people, I am come hither to die. I am condemned not for my own acts, but by the law. I do not deserve death, but I accept it willingly. I pray you all to bear me witness that I die a true Christian woman, holding fast to my faith until the last breath of my life." Her words silenced the crowd. No one dared interrupt. Some bowed their heads, others wept quietly. Even the soldiers shifted uncomfortably, as if ashamed to be there. Jane then turned to the executioner, a tall man with an axe in his hand and remorse in his eyes. "Will you take it quickly?" she asked. The man nodded but couldn't speak. "Then I pray you," she continued gently, "do it well, and my death shall end your sorrow." Before kneeling, she handed her gloves and handkerchief to one of her ladies. Then she opened her small Bible one last time, placed it beside her, and whispered a final verse under her breath. She removed her outer gown and stood in her simple underdress, a white cloth tied around her waist. There was nothing regal about her now, only purity. When the priest stepped closer, offering to cover her eyes, she declined. "I will blindfold myself." Her lady handed her the cloth, and Jane tied it carefully, her fingers moving with calm precision until darkness covered her completely. And then came the silence. The kind of silence that feels like the world itself is holding its breath. She knelt and reached forward to find the block. Her hands trembled slightly, searching for the edge. For a moment, she couldn't find it. Her voice broke for the first time. "What shall I do? Where is it?" she whispered, her words filled with confusion and fear. A stranger's hand guided hers gently to the block. She touched it, and a sense of relief passed through her body. "Now I am ready," she said softly. She stretched her arms forward, laid her head upon the wood, and whispered, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." The executioner waited for a signal, his face pale, his hands shaking. When the official nodded, he raised the axe. There was a pause, a brief, unbearable hesitation, and then the sound that ended her life. One stroke. The axe fell clean. The sound of it cut through the crowd like thunder. No one moved. No one cheered. The silence afterward was worse than any cry. Her head was lifted, as was the custom, and the words were spoken, "Behold the head of a traitor," but no one repeated them. The people refused. To them, this was not treason, it was martyrdom. The executioner dropped his weapon, trembling. He turned away, weeping into his hands. Those nearest to the scaffold crossed themselves. Even the priest's voice faltered as he began to pray. Her ladies, unable to contain their grief, rushed forward. One of them lifted Jane's Bible from the scaffold and pressed it to her chest. Blood had splattered across its pages. The guard moved to take it away, but the woman refused to let go. She whispered through tears. Her words are all that remain pure. Within minutes, it was over. Her body was wrapped in linen and placed beside the remains of her husband. No hymns, no procession, just a hurried burial in the chapel within the tower grounds. The priest said the last rites softly, almost in shame. He could not meet the eyes of the few who stayed to witness. The news of her death spread quickly through London. In taverns and markets, people whispered that the young queen had died as bravely as any man. Others called it murder, though they didn't dare say it too loudly. Even Queen Mary, when she heard the report, is said to have fallen silent. Some claimed she wept in private. Others said she prayed for Jane's soul. But no prayer could undo what had been done. For the council, her death closed a chapter. For the Church, it was a victory. But for England, it was a wound that never truly healed. A nation that had killed its own innocent child to protect its throne. A lesson written not in ink, but in blood. In the days that followed, her Bible circulated quietly among believers. On one of its pages, stained and worn, was a note written in her final hours. "If my fault deserved death, then justice is done. But I was born for another world." Those words spread beyond the tower, whispered in secret gatherings, passed from hand to hand like a relic. They called her the Innocent Queen, a name she never asked for, yet one she earned with every moment of her short, tragic life. Her story became more than a memory. It became a warning, a reminder of what happens when ambition outweighs compassion, when faith becomes a weapon, when power demands the blood of the pure. Jane Grey's execution wasn't just the end of a young girl's life. It was the moment England learned how easily righteousness can be silenced. But even in death, she won a victory no crown could give her. She died unbroken, uncorrupted, and unafraid. History remembered her as a queen of 9 days, but in truth, she reigned far longer, in the conscience of every generation that dared to ask why a child had to die to make adults feel powerful. After her death, silence became her monument. No bells rang, no proclamations were made. The court wanted her gone, not just in body, but in memory. Yet the harder they tried to erase her, the stronger her image grew. The people began to whisper her name in secret, not as a queen, but as something pure, the girl who wouldn't bow. The officials thought they'd buried a mistake. Instead, they had created a martyr. In taverns and churches, quiet conversations began to rise. Stories of her courage, her calm, her words on the scaffold. Even those who had once shouted for her death began to feel shame. They remembered her not as a ruler, but as a child who met her end with grace when grown men trembled before power. The government suppressed talk of her. Books that mentioned her reign were edited. Her letters were confiscated. But one thing they could never destroy was the memory of how she faced her death. No crown, no kingdom, no sword could erase that image. A 16-year-old girl standing before her killers and forgiving them. Those who had served her in the tower kept her words alive. The guards who had wept at her death told their children about her composure. The women who had prepared her for execution spoke of her serenity, each retelling softened into something sacred. The tower, once a place of fear, began to feel haunted not by her ghost, but by her peace. The Catholic court tried to turn her execution into a symbol of triumph, but it backfired. Her death did not strengthen their authority, it exposed its cruelty. People began to question how faith could justify the killing of a child whose only crime was obedience. Her death didn't end rebellion, it fueled reflection. Even those loyal to Queen Mary began to whisper that something holy had been lost that day. Years later, when Elizabeth came to the throne, the story of Jane Grey resurfaced, not as treason, but as tragedy. Elizabeth reportedly kept a portrait of her cousin in her chambers, saying little about it, but never removing it. To her, Jane represented the price of survival in a world where purity was punished and power was survival. Jane's writings outlived her crown. Her final letters circulated in secret, copied by hand by those who saw her as the embodiment of faith under fire. One sentence in particular echoed across generations: "The fear of man is a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord shall be safe." To many, she had become not a victim of politics, but a saint of conscience. Even historians centuries later struggled to define her. Was she a puppet, a martyr, or a queen? Perhaps she was all three. She had been used, betrayed, and destroyed by the same system that pretended to protect her. But she had refused the one thing they demanded: submission. When her faith was tested, she didn't bow. When death approached, she didn't beg. In a world built on compromise, she remained absolute. Her story forced England to confront itself. The monarchy had executed its own blood, not for treason but for politics. The church had sanctioned it in the name of God, and the people had watched. Her death became a mirror reflecting the nation's hypocrisy. The same empire that prided itself on divine order had proven it was willing to kill innocents to maintain control. For centuries, writers and thinkers revisited her final days, trying to understand the calmness of her final words. Some said it was faith, others called it resignation, but the truth is simpler. She understood that the only thing left to control was how she would die. Power had taken her freedom, her crown, and her name, but it could not touch her conscience. That she carried unbroken to the end. The cruelty of her execution lay not in the act itself, but in the reason behind it. Jane Grey was not executed for what she had done, but for what she represented. A Protestant symbol in a Catholic reign, a reminder of rebellion, a living challenge to the fragile legitimacy of Mary's rule. Killing her was not justice, it was strategy. It was politics dressed in the robes of righteousness. Her name began to appear in hymns, in letters, in quiet memorials written by those who had never met her. Even centuries later, her life still provokes discomfort, not because she was powerful, but because she was powerless and still refused to yield. That refusal continues to echo as the truest form of strength. When history speaks of kings and conquerors, their victories fill pages. But Jane Grey's power lay in her defeat. She lost everything, yet held on to the one thing that cannot be taken: integrity. In her short life, she achieved what countless rulers never could. She ruled her own soul. Her legacy is not carved in stone or wrapped in gold. It is written in the hearts of those who believe that quiet defiance can be louder than armies. The story of Lady Jane Grey is not about a fallen queen. It is about what remains when everything else is stripped away: faith, truth, and the courage to stand alone. They tried to erase her from the record, but history has a way of protecting the innocent. Over time, her story re-emerged, not as a footnote, but as a wound that never closed. Teachers began to speak her name again. Writers called her the Innocent Queen, the 9-Day Miracle, the Lamb of the Tower. Each title carried sorrow but also reverence. More than 4 centuries later, visitors still pause before her resting place inside the Tower Chapel. There is no crown on her tomb, only her name. Yet even that name carries more weight than the titles of those who condemned her. Because in the end, history did what power never could. It told the truth. Lady Jane Grey was never meant to rule a kingdom. She was meant to reveal it. Her death exposed the fear that hides behind authority, the fragility of faith when wielded as power, and the eternal truth that innocence terrifies tyrants. They could take her life, but not her light. And that is why, even now, her story still burns, quietly, defiantly, in the conscience of the world. Lady Jane Grey's story is not just about a fallen queen, it is about the courage to remain pure in a corrupt world. She lived briefly, but her dignity outlived empires. The system that killed her feared her strength, not her weakness. In her silence, she exposed the loudest truth of all, that innocence terrifies power. History called her the 9-Day Queen, but time has renamed her the girl who wouldn't bow. And perhaps that is her greatest victory. Not the crown she lost, but the soul no one could ever take.